Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Our next guest, we're going to be talking about the trial of the century. But the trial of the century was the 19th century, and the defendant was noted Congressman Dan Sickles. Chris DeRose, welcome to Connor's Corner.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so the name of your book is Scandal, Sex, Murder, and the Trial That Changed America. Can you give the audience a little bit of a background?
Yeah, so Spangled Scandal is about the killing of the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. in front of the White House by Congressman Dan Sickles for having an affair with his wife. And, of course, the U.S. Attorney in this case is American royalty. He's the son of Francis Scott Key, author of our national anthem, and the country was hooked. It was the first scandal and the first major news story we all followed together. Public couldn't get enough of it.
Now, who was Dan Sickles? He was a congressman. Where was he from?
New York City. And he was a close ally of President James Buchanan.
Who was president at that time.
Absolutely, yeah.
How does the murder take place? Can you describe that to us?
Sure. So Sickles receives an anonymous letter one evening telling him that his wife's having this affair with Barton Key, that they've rented a house in the neighborhood north of the White House for carrying on their affair. And the letter is just so specific that Sickles decides he has to investigate. And turns out he's able to establish the veracity of the letter, and he's deciding what to do. And he's in his house, and he's got two of his old New York friends with him, and they're trying to talk him down off the ledge and trying to coach him, into how he could get out of this situation with minimal embarrassment or damage to his reputation. And then Barton Key shows up in Lafayette Square waving a handkerchief at the house, which is the prearranged signal for him to go meet Sickles' wife, Teresa. And so Sickles loses it. Whether he loses his mind is something that gets discussed at trial, but loses it and goes outside wearing three guns under a trench coat on an unseasonably warm February day and kills the U.S. Attorney right across from the White House.
How many times did he shoot Key?
It's undetermined. He at least made contact with him three times. There were a number of blanks and misfires. But he fires quite a few shots over the course of 2 or 3 minutes based on the eyewitness testimony.
Obviously, then, he gets indicted. What's the charge?
He's charged with murder.
Where does the trial take place?
It's in Washington, D.C. The building is still there. At this time, it was the City Hall for Washington, D.C. Currently, it's the D.C. Court of Appeals building. And, there's not enough room for everyone who wants to come in and see it. People are climbing in the windows. The entire police force of Washington, D.C. had night and day had to be deployed to protect the courtroom from the intense interest from the public. And it's really your first modern media scandal because you just had the telegraph scale across the country. And so you have people writing reports, detailed verbatim trial testimony, back to all the corners of the country almost in real time.
Who's the prosecuting attorney?
It's a guy named Robert Ould. This is a singular event in American legal history. Dan Sickles had killed the guy who otherwise would have been charged with prosecuting him. And so President Buchanan had to appoint somebody new and wait for the Senate to confirm him before we could proceed to trial. And so Ould had been Barton Key's deputy, really was the better lawyer of the two.
But for political reasons?
Political reasons. Key had been the U.S. attorney, but he had dumped all of his work onto Ould to varying degrees over a course of years. And, as I write in the book, Ould had been vexed in life by Key, sort of putting so much responsibility on him. And then when Key dies, he lives with the greatest responsibility of his career, which is getting a murder conviction in the most intense media environment that had ever existed up to that point.
Dan Sickles puts together kind of his dream team, doesn't he?
It's the original dream team. As soon as word spread that Sickles gotten arrested, people, his friends and family and colleagues start hiring every lawyer they can find of any reputation. And so you have James Brady, who is the greatest lawyer in New York City, probably the greatest lawyer in the United States, who comes down to Washington to lead the defense. You have Edwin Stanton, who is a year from serving in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet as Secretary of War during our Civil War, and at this time is one of the best regarded lawyers in the country. And so Brady and Stanton will helm up this team of numerous lawyers from all over the country who are gathered to try to stop Sickles from being hanged.
Sickles is indicted for murder. Everybody saw him see, or a lot of people saw him shoot Key. What's his defense?
He's got a few defenses. Number one, he says the man who kills the seducer of his wife, and seducers in quotes, they always talk about, the man as the seducer in this scenario, and they say, the woman has no agency in the situation. So they argue, look, the man who seduces another man's wife, if he is killed, he's no victim in this case, and the man who shoots him is no criminal. So that was the first argument they made. The second is that even if you don't buy that, we don't know that the bullet found in Key didn't match one of the guns found at the scene. Maybe that was Key's gun. Maybe Sickles was just acting in self-defense here when he put on 3 guns under a trench coat and wandered into Lafayette Square. But if neither of those are satisfactory, they argue that Sickles was temporarily insane. That yes, while people had interacted with Sickles immediately prior to the shooting and after the shooting, during the time it took to arm himself and go into Lafayette Square, Sickles was temporarily insane.
Now, was that a common defense back then?
No, in fact, it's quite novel. The sort of modern test for insanity had just come over from the United Kingdom. It's a Manhattan test. It centers on whether you know the wrongfulness of your actions, whether you know the difference between right or wrong. And people had started to plead, the insanity defense. But in this case, Sickles couldn't plead insanity because people had interacted with him before and after the killing, and he was quite well aware of his surroundings and what he was doing. And so they argued that he was just temporarily insane. It's a very novel defense here in the Sickles case.
What happened? What did the jury say?
Jury said he was not guilty. And I want to make clear, too, this sometimes gets dismissed as a 19th century jury falling for pseudoscience. Actually, the jury just wanted to let him go. The jury was persuaded that Key had gotten what he deserved, that Teresa Sickles could have been any of their wives, and that, frankly, Sickles had done the community of Washington a favor by getting rid of this guy.
So, now, the jury, they didn't have any women on the jury back then.
No women on the jury. In fact, the only women who were allowed in the courtroom were witnesses.
And so who were Sickles' witnesses? Who said he was, temporarily insane?
Well, they brought in a guy who had gone to college with him and had witnessed him get very distraught when his mentor on the faculty had died. And so they tried to establish that Sickles was prone to bouts of mania. They argued that, they really try hard to introduce evidence of the affair at every opportunity. So you've got people who saw Key in Lafayette Square waving his handkerchief. So they try to bring in evidence. And then when they can't get, Teresa signed a confession for Daniel Sickles on the night before Key was killed. And the defense tries to bring this into evidence, and the judge excludes it. And so the defense team, against Sickles' wishes and without his knowledge, leaks it to the press in the hopes that it'll get into the jury room.
All right, so he's acquitted. What happens?
So he's a pariah in D.C. He sends his family back to New York, does reconcile with his wife, and he really finds his voice during the secession crisis in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession movement that starts sweeping through the South. And he is a firm advocate for the Union, for the South accepting the results of the election. And when ultimately it's clear that the South will not accept the results of the election, he raises thousands of men in New York City and becomes a general in the Civil War.
And of course, that could be another discussion, but I understand your book doesn't go into his Civil War career or his post-Civil War career.
Just, we talk about his momentous decision on day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg, and certainly, probably more ink has been spilled on both sides of that debate than any other decision in American military history. Still very controversial to this day. But that was Sickles' nature, and it does end with a fantastic story of Sickles after the Civil War encountering the son of Barton Key.
Now, let me ask you something. What happens to his wife? They get divorced, right?
No, he actually takes her back, which, in this is, everything is sort of set up against Teresa. She's denied any sort of agency in the situation. They describe Key as her seducer. they sort of talk about her sort of like a child who was taken advantage of. So on one hand, she has no agency, but on the other hand, she bears all of the blame. So she's the one who gets cast out of society. She's the one whose only hope to ever have a husband is for the husband she has to forgive her and take her back. If he had divorced her, her chances of ever having another husband would have been pretty close to zero. So she really gets the worst of it here, but he ends up reconciling with her and taking her back. And that's much to the chagrin of the public. There's this incident where a group of women are watching Sickles speak in Congress, and they can tell that, the first woman says, boy, that guy down there, who is he? He's being shunned by his colleagues. And the second woman says, oh, well, that's because he killed Barton Key. And the third woman says, no, that was all right. The problem is that he went back to his wife afterwards.
It's a totally different world, I guess, and it's hard to get into the 19th century mind. But what does the Sickles case mean to America?
A couple things. It completely changed the way we think about news and think about information. This blurring of the line between entertainment and news, this obsession we have with the scandal of the day, with celebrities, with famous trials. This all started with the Sickles case. Prior to Sickles, the most famous crime in American history, a murder of Helen Jewett, was covered with a few paragraphs here and there in sporadic news coverage. In the Sickles case, there's daily coverage, transcripts of the trial. The press is trying to wring every last detail out of every single person on the periphery of the case. This scandal-obsessed culture, where the culture of breaking news, it all starts with the Sickles case. It all starts right here. This is the blueprint for it.
Politically, what effect did it have, on the nation? Sickles was a congressman. He was a noted Democrat, Tammany Hall. What effect did the case, the outcome of the case, have in American politics?
What's interesting, like today, these scandals take our attention away from issues that are arguably much more important. So during the Sickles trial, you have violence in Kansas. You have John Brown moving toward Harper's Ferry. You have all these events that have either taken place or about to take place. They're going to throw the country into civil war. And all America can pay attention to or talk about or care about is this lurid affair that led to a murder that's now a sensational trial. And so, that was a political effect. And actually, it's interesting, Democratic presidential candidates, hopefuls for 1860, started showing up at the Sickles trial because they knew that was the only way to get their name in the paper.
Well, let me ask you something. The trial, this is over 150 years ago. Why did you write the book? What do you think the reader can get out of this book? What's the point?
I think it's, number one, it's just one of the most fascinating things that ever happened in America. Just one of the most amazing stories on every level, filled with the most vivid characters that you wouldn't even dare to make up if you were writing fiction. And you have this confluence of people coming together in Washington, D.C. on the eve of the Civil War, the birth of our scandal-obsessed culture, media culture. And I wanted to see where it all started. This media frenzy we live in today, this focus and obsession with scandal. Where did this all start? So if you love true crime, if you just love a good story, if you love American legal history or trials, or you're interested in the press and the way we think about news and breaking news, this story can appeal to you on a lot of different levels. If you're interested in any of those things, and I'm interested in all of them, that was why I wrote this book, and that's why I think people have enjoyed reading it.
In your mind, was Sickles guilty of murder?
Yes. It is very clear there's no defense to homicide in the District of Columbia based on whether your wife's having an affair with someone else. You just can't take the law into your own hands and shoot the person. Now, for about 100 years after the Sickles trial, and largely as a consequence of the Sickles trial, it was almost impossible to punish anyone who had killed their spouse's lover. There's something called the unwritten law. It was the most rigidly adhered to law in the country, and you couldn't find it in any rule book or in any case. But throughout the country, juries were getting rid of these charges if they were ever being charged at all. Governors were pardoning people. Judges were throwing cases out of court under these circumstances. So for nearly 100 years, it ends like in 1958. We're not talking about ancient history, where you have someone killing to avenge their family's honor could not be convicted. But murder is the unlawful taking of a human life. And clearly in these cases, these killings were contrary to the law. There was no defense. The unwritten law was something that jurors observed, but wasn't written in any statute book, couldn't find it in any case.
All right. Well, the name of the book, Spangled Scandal, Sex, Murder, and the Trial That Changed America. The author, Chris DeRose, thank you for being on Connor's Corner.
Pleasure. And if anyone would like to connect with me, I'm at ChrisDeRoseBooks.com.
ChrisDeRoseBooks.com?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.